Alright, so we had our world. We were able to test. Now let's look at setting up a little bit more than that. We want to adjust this method. So basically, we want to just give it some parameters and have it create based off the parameters that we give it. So right now, we have it where it's giving a size and it's automatically just doing a circle shape. We should probably change that so we can change and do different shapes. So let's go ahead and we're going to want to put another switch in here. Switch, and we want the type. So let's say that we are passing in. Let's just add something here. We're passing in. We passed in the type, the dynamic body. Let's say that we're passing in an int, and we'll call this body type. Okay, and that's just going to represent, we pass in, say, a number, then we could use that to design our shapes that we want. So case 0 will be our default. That will be this. Let's go ahead and copy that out, and then we want to break. And let's say if we enter case 1, then instead of a circle shape, we want a square or a box. So let's do a polygon shape. So that would be polygon shape, and I'll call that one shape. And let's do shape, shape. Okay, so let's if you type 0, then you're assigning the shape as a circle shape. If you're typing 1, then we want a new polygon shape. Okay, now for using a polygon shape, there's a couple different things that we could do. Shape dot. Now this is a polygon shape, so it's going to take a little bit different. We could do set. Hold on. I want to do polygon shape. I'm going to cast it. Shape. All right, now we could give vertex angles. Set as box seems to be the best for me to do it because I can just give it the width and the height. Now, it's not just the width and it's not just the height. It is actually the half width and the half height. That's why it's HX. So I'm passing in my size, my float size. We already have that size for the radius dividing by 2. Well, let's just go ahead and do that. But if we set it as a box, we could do size divided by 2. That's my half width, and we could do size divided by 2. So it's going to create a square box. I can continue to keep changing this method to do basically whatever I want it to do. Okay, so now let's say they don't put anything, so let's do a default. I'm going to break out of it. We'll just default it to a circle shape if they don't put anything in there. Okay, so now we have that. What's those errors that are showing up? Alright, so now we create a body. the next thing that we have to do is we got to pass it that number. So this one I want it to be a circle, and this one, give me the. We actually want it to be a different shape, and this is going to represent our ground. So let's do we'll make it a 1, and force again, because it's static, doesn't really matter. I can go ahead and just put that as 0. But I want this to be much bigger. I want this to actually be the full width of the screen. So camera dot viewport width is going to be my size. Now I want it initially set the center, but I want it at 0. So it's probably going to be cut in half. I might want to subtract from that, but we could see. And we want to create a bunch of different bodies of different sizes just so we can see it interacting with each other. So let's do a for loop. And we're going to say int I is equal to 0, and we want to create we want to create 10 bodies, I plus plus, and we want it positioned instead of positioning it in the center, we're going to have them cascading over to the left. So let's just put that as I, starting at the top, and we want the size to be random. So let's go ahead and create a random variable so it will resize kind of dynamically. So I'll just put that under the Box2d, random. Let's import that. Alright, so here when we create it, random is equal to mass utils dot random. We want a random size, so float. I need to put a value in there. Actually, that's supposed to be float. That helps. Alright. So we want it to be, let's say, a value from a minimum of 1 to, let's say, 5. Okay. Where we're having it start at 1, end at 5. And that's going to produce a random number. That's our initial. And actually, we're going to move this, instead of putting that here, we want it to do it every time we're creating a body. So inside here, let's go ahead and just have it calculate every time. All right. Oops, that's the wrong place, isn't it? We want it inside of that int for loop. Alright, so now I can say random. It's going to give that size. So now we have positions that are going to increase from left to right, and it's going to give different sizes. And then after it's finished, we are creating the body for the ground. Let's go ahead and see that so that we can start setting up our stuff. loading screen, main menu, there's a game. Alright, we didn't get to see it because that box is all the way in our world. We need to position that down. So let's position that down at, we want not just 0, but we want to actually put that position, the center of the body, down approximately half that width. So camera dot viewport height divided by 2, and then let's just add 1 to that so we can see it. Let me close this one. That's better. Okay. The issue that you've seen at the start is because they were all generated almost, some were overlapping. So the world ended up pushing them out so that they're not touching because they should not overlap. But we see that it's interacting with each other and with the world. Well, that is kind of an issue. We don't want it to interact with anything other than, let's say, the floor. So one of the ways that we can do that is we can start filtering things out. Okay, so we want these bodies to not interact with each other, just to get created. And then for the floor, that's what we want it to interact with, only that. Okay, so in our method, we have to set a couple things. So let's here, when we're doing our fdef, we can do fdef dot filter, and then we can pass in our category bits and mask bits. Category bits it's a short value, so you can use short type math for it. Is what our body is. Mask bits is what we are saying we are going to interact with right now. Now everything is interacting with everything because that is not set. Once we set it, it won't interact with anything anymore until we tell it what we want it to interact with. Now you're limited though on how many that you can pick, so you're going to have to be mindful. Since it's using a short, you're limited to like 16 different types. Okay, so we want to actually pass in a short. So let's go ahead, just for this sake, let's create an enum. So let's do a public enum, and we're going to call it interaction type. Okay, so we have, let's say, we got ground, and we have, let's call them players. Okay, and let's just go ahead and we'll eventually do enemies too. So in here, we want to pass that in. So we're going to have another. The filter, the category bits, and the mask bits are going to get set based off what we pass in. So the filter dot category bits is going to equal what we pass in here. So we gave it a body type. Now let's give it a little bit more. So instead of just having the body, we're going to say what it is. So this is interaction type. Let's call it self, and the interaction type, and we'll call that interaction. So now our category bits we can pass in and say that that would be self. All right, it's got to be a short. Let's not do that. Then it's an enum. So private static, because it does need to change, final, and we'll do ground, and that equals 1. Oops, short. That equals 1. Private static final short. And we'll do player equals 2, and private static final short, and this will be enemy equals 3. Okay. Now we're actually not going to be passing in via enum. We're going to pass it in short, and this will be self short. This will be interaction. Okay, so now our category bits is going to get set by what we pass in as a self, and then we need to do what we want it to filter against. So the mass bits is going to be the interaction. Okay, so now we got to add those things to our methods here. Let me just click on it so we can see it better. All right, so these bodies, if I go ahead and I say, hey, this is player, those are players, and they are interacting with the ground. Okay, if I ran this, it would not do anything because both parties have to have that handshake. So the ground, I have to also say, is going to interact with that player. So I need to add the category bits and mass bits for the ground. So this would be ground, and it's interacting with the player. All right, now if we run this, we should see that all those players that we created are not interacting with each other anymore, but they're still interacting with the ground. So if you have in your game where you want your enemies to not really interact with each other, or if you do, you have to make sure that you're setting that. Once you start setting the category bits and mass bits, you got to make sure that you're being consistent all around. If there's an issue where they're not interacting with each other, it's because you didn't set both of them. So now they didn't get pushed away, but they are still interacting with my ground. Okay? All right, so we could bump this down. Let's do where we're only doing 3 of the player. I'm going to copy this again, and we'll do 3 of the enemy. And now this is enemy. If I run this, the enemies are going to go through the ground because I'm not filtering here. So I could have them interact with each other. Let's have the enemies actually get created at a much higher height. So they will drop on top. Viewport height plus 10. So they'll get created much higher than all the players. Now I need to have where it's interacting. The enemies are interacting with the ground or with the player. So I want to return either one of these. Now let's go ahead and I have to actually put that in. Get me over there. I gotta cast it to a short. There we go. Alright. So now I have the enemies. They're interacting with the ground and they're interacting with the player. Now if I want this to interact with the enemies, I have to set that. So they're going to interact with the ground and they're going to interact with the player. So I'm going to do the same thing. Short, and players are interacting with the ground or with the enemy. So I have to keep doing this for all things. So enemies are interacting with ground and with player. The player is interacting with the ground and an enemy. If I don't change this one, the enemies will just sink through that floor, but they'll still interact with the players. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like. This is where issues happen when you start using the category bits and mask bits, because I don't need to have everything interact. I could have some enemies that are able to walk through walls, and I need to make sure that they're not interacting with the level, but my player is. So I just have to do that setting. Let's see where we created them. We had them starting at 0. Let's go ahead and start them at 2 so we can see more of them. And we don't really need to have them that big. Well, this is starting at, let's say, 3. And this is going to, I want 6 of them. So 3, 4, 5. So I'll stop at 6. That'll give me 3. And this, 2, 3, 4, stop at 5. Okay. Now this is giving me a higher height, but I'm still starting at that position. All right, let's run it again. So those were the enemies that they dropped. Let's take that one off, see if it didn't interact. I'll have the enemy not interact with the ground. Actually, I want the enemies to interact just with the player, but not with the ground. I want it to actually go into the ground. So it's only going to interact with the player. So they'll bounce off the players, but then they should sink through the ground. Now there's one other issue that it could be, and that's because I did 1, 2, 3 instead of doing shorts in terms of it always doubling. So they interacted with the player, but not with the ground. Now the issue and why I said there's only 16 is because ground, all of these should be in a base of 2. So if ground is 2, then player is not going to be 3. It should be 4. Because if I do that, I will never end up having a repeat where it's trying to do it. It's easy to determine. So I'm always just going to double whenever I go it. So 2, 4, 4 times 2 is 8. Now if I ran this again, it would be more predictable. That was also part of the issue. But what we see is that the enemies, they interact with the players, but they do not interact with the ground. So I can play around with this when I'm creating bodies and start dealing with that. So right now we just have gravitational forces, but if I start applying force to them for them to move around, interacting with the players, not with the ground. Okay, so that is how we can end up just doing simple Box2d, that we can set up category bits and mask bits. Now remember, category bits you have to use a short, and math bits you also have to use a short, but that allows you to use short math. So when we have to do that, you want to make sure, because if I say 2 or 4, it would be 0, 0, 1, 0, or 0, 1, 0, 0. So then when I'm doing the OR, it's going to end up saying 0, 1, 1, 0. If you need to study up a little bit on it, I would go ahead and just do some quick research, Java, short math, and that'll give you kind of an indication of what you need to do. But these are setting our categories of what we want to do, and then we can pass that into our create body method and build out that type of reaction that we want using what we want to interact with. Now, another thing that we have to make sure is that after we define what we're interacting with, we have to do it both ways. If we only do it one way, it won't work. So if I have the enemy interacting with the player and I don't have it set here, and I don't say that the player is interacting with the enemy, but I said that the enemy is interacting with the player, when I run this, we're not going to see an interaction because it has to happen both ways. Once you start using category bits and mask bits, you got to make sure, because that is an easy issue to miss and then cause you all kinds of issues. So let's just go ahead and quickly see that so you can see that it's not doing it if I don't set it right. See, no interaction with the player because I didn't have that set. Even though I said that I'm interacting with the player, because I didn't say that that the player is interacting with the enemy, I didn't have an interaction. So you have to be mindful of that. Again, it's still really just using our world.step. The next video we're going to look into actually applying some forces, impulse, and some velocity.